Use in our schools, and our host, Mike Mulhall.
Good evening. Welcome to our show this evening. Tonight we're going to be discussing the subject of child sexual abuse, which is an unpleasant one, but one of great importance because when children are sexually abused, there are often long-term consequences. Our guests tonight are Dr. Charles Shakeshaft, a professor of education at Hofstra University, and Frank Russo of the American Family Association of New York. Dr. Shakeshaft is an internationally recognized researcher on the subject of educator sexual misconduct. Frank Russo has spoken and written about the serious deficiencies in New York state laws pertaining to the reporting of child sexual abuse. My co-host tonight is Donna Van Norden. Donna?
Thanks, Mike. Dr. Shakeshaft, would you please summarize for us some of the key findings of your report done for the United States Department of Education on the child sexual abuse in our schools?
The report looked at the percentage of students who report that they have been the targets of educator sexual misconduct. The best estimates we have, given the studies that are available, are that about 10% of kids report having been targeted by someone who works in the school, primarily a teacher or coach. Of the 10% is all kinds of educator sexual misconduct, could include verbal, visual, physical. But nearly 7% of kids report physical sexual misconduct targeted at them, which include touching on the breasts, the buttocks, or all the way to rape.
Frank, what is the nature of the problem in our state regarding the reporting of sexual abuse in our state, in New York, regarding its laws?
It's a truly remarkable situation that we're in, and Dr. Shakeshaft's study, I think, was a tremendous eye-opener for me and a reinforcement of a problem that I had no idea existed 3 short years ago, till we had the scandal in the Catholic Church, and then other studies that I began looking into. When the scandal in the church first arose, legislation was proposed to add clergy to New York state law to the list of what's called mandated reporters. In New York State, certain professionals who routinely deal with children, such as doctors and dentists, daycare workers, teachers, are listed as mandated reporters, which means they are required by law to report to law enforcement agencies any knowledge of child sexual abuse, children being under 17. So when they discovered that clergy were not included, they said, let's add clergy to the list of mandated reporters. Everyone said, no one disagreed with that. Everyone agreed with that. Let's add clergy. So everyone unanimously said, let's do it. This was in 2002. The New York State Legislature then began to change the law in that regard. But then someone up in Albany discovered another gaping hole in the problem. They found out that all these mandated reporters are required to report in terms of child sexual abuse to law enforcement is child abuse by the parent or guardian, which is about a quarter of all child abuse, about a quarter. 3/4 is done by non-parents of the victims, measured from the victim standpoint. 75% of victims are victimized by non-parents. So then they said, well, let's require the reporting of all child sexual abuse. Seems logical, common sense. Everyone thought the problem was resolved. Then in June of 2002, I think it was June 28th, the New York Times came out with a fascinating story. I keep that article, it's a half-page article, describing unexpected problems. 2 groups objected to reporting all child sexual abuse. I think it was Family Planning Advocates and the New York Civil Liberties Union. And they had a particular problem, I think, with statutory rape, rape of a minor by an older male, typically. And so from then on, nothing's been done. So here we are, almost 3 years later, 2.5 years later, and child sexual abuse in New York State is still only required to be reported by these, quote, mandated reporters if the abuser is the parent. Anyone else, there's no requirement. Now, teachers are not aware of this. Teachers say, well, I have to report it. Yeah, they have to report it within the school system, within the educational system. And what we're finding out is that the overwhelming preponderance of educators, and this is true in any other area as well, in education, they report it within the system, they move the teacher out. There's an expression they call passing the garbage, passing the trash. And rarely does the teacher ever get reported to law enforcement, maybe 1% of the time. 99% of the time, maybe the teacher retires, 15% of the time, or they get moved to another school. And it could be a maintenance worker, by the way, not only teachers. But it's a humongous problem, and it was Dr. Shakespeare's study that, again, contributed to the quantification of the problem. I don't want to belabor this, but I told Dr. before, if you had asked me 3 years ago, how many adults do you think were ever abused as children? 3 years ago, I would have said, if I had to guess, 100,000. The truth is that numbers range all the way up to 40 million. I mean, I don't know if I buy that, but it's at least 20 million. I'd say that's a safe number. It's between 20 and 40 million adult Americans were sexually abused as children. It's a big, big problem.
That leads us to another question, I think, because you raise a good point, Frank, that just as far back as 3 years ago, given, most people's awareness was not that great regarding this issue, but it became greater due to the scandal in the Catholic Church regarding sexual abuse. In particular, the media seemed to focus on that, much to the exclusion of the rest of society. In particular, the New York Times and both Long Island Newsday seemed to dedicate a tremendous amount of time to this topic, but at the same time, I don't recall them sharing anywhere near the same concern for your findings, Dr. Shakeshaft, when they first came out. Your report indicates a problem in our schools, I think to quote you, quote, more than 100 times worse than in the Catholic Church, end quote. Do you have any idea at all why the major media or even the local media failed to cover this very important report that you wrote?
I don't know. Actually, when the U.S. Department of Education released my report in July, the AP took up the story, and it was in newspapers all over the country, on television and radio programs. In the first day, the U.S. Department of Education had 20,000 hits to get a copy of the report, so people were interested in it. Major newspapers across the country covered it. I don't know why Newsday and the New York Times didn't cover it.
I mean, both these publications, and we're not trying to single them out, but they've dedicated an enormous amount of resources to not only just sexual misconduct within the Catholic Church, but to other topics nationally, politically, consistently chronicling these events week in, week out, day in, day out, and yet nowhere could we find that same type of reporting dedicated to this important topic. And when it comes out that it may be 100 times worse than what was in the Catholic Church, what have you found to be the overall response to your report?
Well, parents are concerned. People are concerned, but people don't know where to start. I think one of the problems is they don't know who to turn to. The difference between the Catholic Church and school districts is we tend to think of the Catholic Church as one organizational entity, although we know that it's not, but we tend to think of it that way. School districts are local entities, so that while this may be a problem nationwide, people tend to think, well, it doesn't happen in my school district, or if it's happened, it's only happened once or twice, it's not a big thing. So it's a matter of scale and knowing what to do to try to stop the problem.
I see. And I mean, and to dovetail along those questions, Frank, I would direct the question to you then, that maybe is it as a result of the lack of reporting, the lack of people willing to tackle this issue because of its size, of how large it is, how systemic it may be? What extent of this cover-up is a problem in our state law, and why are our lawmakers, either unfamiliar with this problem or unwilling to tackle this problem?
Well, just to get on to just elaborate a little bit more on this point, I did contact Long Island Newsday and the editors, the news editor, Mr. Schneider at Newsday. I went to a top editor at New York Times, emailed them. I got no response from Newsday, none at all. Emailed them again, no response. The New York Times, I did get a response. They said, we're going to look at it, we're going to examine this and see if it's worthy of coverage. And nothing, to my knowledge, has ever appeared. I spoke to John Hildebrand, whom I have a great deal of respect for at Newsday, the education editor. He was aware of the study, and all he could tell me is he passed it up, but others above him evidently did not see it fit to cover. And just to put it, the numbers, to quote the numbers, in the Catholic Church, the John Jay College study reported that there were some 10,000 victims over 50 years, which means 200 victims per year. The numbers here in Dr. Shakeshaft's study were 290,000 victims over 10 years,
Wow.
or 29,000 victims a year. So 200 victims per year in America, in the Catholic Church, 29,000 victims per year in our schools, which is probably proportionate, by the way, to the number of teachers and clergy and so forth. I think it's proportional. I don't think it's, in other words, the problem is as bad in the schools as it is in the church, or vice versa. And what the bishops did in covering up, the superintendents are doing. And we have a problem here, folks. If the superintendents are covering this up, and why are they covering it up? Not that they're malicious people, I don't think. The law doesn't require them to go to law enforcement. They're doing what the law requires, which is to report it to the education department, and they keep, you know, numbers on this, and they move the teachers out, and they pass them to other states, or they allow them to retire. They want to avoid commotion. I think they're weighing the publicity that would come. This is my opinion now. They're weighing the publicity that would come, which would be terrible when you report child abuse in a school by an employee of the school district. It's very harmful to the reputation of the school district. I understand that. But on the other hand, failure to deal with this and to pass this teacher or worker to another school district is the same as passing a priest to another parish. What I don't understand is why Newsday and the New York Times, who literally had roughly 200 stories in Newsday, maybe 80 stories in the New York Times over a 2.5-year period, on the Catholic Church, not one blessed story on this, which is 145 times the problem. We don't hear a word about it. I'm at a loss to understand it. It's beyond my comprehension. They're making bad decisions, just like those bishops made bad decisions. They thought they were doing the right thing, or they listened to psychologists saying, oh, we solved this priest problem. Maybe these superintendents are thinking the same thing, I'm imagining, but that's not the case, because this is a very serious problem when you have this addiction or this problem of abusing children.
I find it astonishing, given the fact that Dr. Shakeshaft is renowned, is here at one of the finest universities in the tri-state area anyway, Hofstra University, of great reputation, that somehow someone right here from our own area who's working with the Department of Education, who would come out with such strong findings, that they could be dismissed so easily by two of the most prominent dailies in our area.
Before we invited Dr. Shakeshaft, I checked. She is very highly regarded, an expert in the field for 12 years in this field. So, I mean, and she's reporting on studies done by reputable organizations, the AAUW.
We're coming up at the halfway point of our show. You're watching the American Family Association presents Sexual Abuse in Our Schools. Our guest tonight is Dr. Charles Shakeshaft of Hofstra University and Frank Russo. Please stay tuned with us. We have an important public service announcement coming up, and then we'll come back to the show.
Over the years, humanity has made terrible mistakes. People were treated as less than human, even killed, because they were a different skin color, because they were a different faith, because they were unplanned, unknown, and helpless. But over time, we are slowly learning that we are all God's children, created in His image, and to disregard the value of human life, whether through hate or indifference, is wrong. That all human creation, regardless of race, religion, abilities, or stage of human life, has an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a right to love and be loved. As Americans, let's cherish the sanctity of life, because we know how it feels when others treat us as less than human.
Welcome back to our show. Tonight we are talking with Dr. Charles Shakeshaft and Frank Russo about sexual abuse in our schools. I want to pick up where we left off. Frank, we were just discussing this topic, and I guess I want to come back to one point. How do you feel about it? Do you feel that our lawmakers are familiar with this problem at this point?
I honestly don't. I mean, it's hard to picture that, but I guess there are so many thousands of bills that they introduce, so I guess we have to be understanding of that. I've spoken to perhaps 15 to 20 legislators personally myself, assemblymen and senators, basically Republican senators and Democratic assemblymen, because that's who holds the power.
New York State government.
New York State government. And some of them are familiar, but most were not. Senator Carl Marcelino is an example. He couldn't believe what I was telling him. He said, Frank, you can't be right. You can't be right. I said, well, Carl, why don't you have your staff check it out and get back to me if I'm wrong? I'd love to know I'm wrong. I'm telling you there's no requirement to report child sexual abuse by the mandated reporters unless the abuser is the parent or guardian. And 3 out of 4 times it's a neighbor, it's someone in the schools, it's a statutory rape case, it's a friend, it's someone else other than the parent. and there's no obligation to report it, which means these people are free to continue doing this activity, which is very harmful, more harmful than certainly I ever imagined, because I never really thought about it before this whole thing erupted a couple of years ago. The legislators do not know, and the two leaders, Senator Bruno and the Republican Senator Leader Bruno, and the Democrat leader in the Assembly, Shelley Silver, they could care less, it seems, because they do know about this and they're not willing to do anything for some reason.
Dr. Shakeshaft, I have a statement and then some questions for you.
Sure.
Child sexual abuse is clearly different from sexual harassment. Both are very, very wrong, but one is far worse and more serious than the other. Does your report distinguish between the two? What might people do about that, and who can they contact regarding this?
Well, we do distinguish between the two, but we tend to believe that there are uniformly agreed upon definitions of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. There aren't. From state to state, different state laws use different definitions. The health professions use different definitions than do the social services professions, than do criminal justice. So the idea that we can somehow divvy up things that happen to our kids and call one sexual harassment and one sexual abuse, it isn't really that clear. What the report did was look at different kinds of behaviors. So some people would say that, for instance, verbal abuse or visual abuse is sexual harassment. One kind of visual abuse is masturbating in front of someone. Do you want to call that less serious? I don't. Another kind of abuse that might be labeled as sexual harassment and therefore quote unquote less serious is showing kids pornography. Do you want to call that less serious? I don't. So what we did was, instead of labeling everything as one thing or the other, I talked about educator sexual misconduct, and then I specifically looked at different kinds of behaviors. So you can go to the report and you can see the difference in terms of behaviors. I don't want to label something less or worse or more serious or less serious. I think it's all serious, and I want people to make those decisions for themselves.
Frank, you gave us some of your reactions to Dr. Shakeshaft's report. Do you have some further?
I agree with everything Dr. Shakeshaft just said. And I think we should be so grateful to her for doing this. And here she's taking, I happen to know she's taken a lot of criticism from people who are upset with this even being discussed, just as there probably were some Catholics who didn't want to hear about that problem there. But the problem is so great and so serious that it needs to be discussed in an intelligent way, which is the way I think Dr. Shakeshaft is discussing it. I have her report. I believe it's 156 pages, documented with all sorts of references. A basic resource or reference was the American Association of University Women Study. That's one of the more believable and credible studies, but they were all pointing to the same thing. And I think the key thing, and Doctor, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think the key thing she's calling for, Dr. Shakeshaft, is let's do some real good research on this. Here we've looked at everything. She didn't do any original research. She was looking at everything that was done and reporting on it. And I read someplace where you're really calling for, let's get the government and look at this problem and let's discuss it in an intelligent, calm, civil way. We don't want people unfairly accused, and I know that occurs sometimes. The worst thing would be for a teacher or anyone to be falsely accused. We understand that. But on the other hand, I have a feeling most of the accusations go unreported that really occur. I think it's a tiny percentage of abuse by anybody gets reported to the authorities. We've got to start discussing this because I'm convinced this is taking a serious toll on our children. It's affecting them later in life. I don't want to get into the ways, but the studies I read are showing various ways children are impacted throughout their lives on this. They put it into their subconscious and forget about it, sort of, but yet it's taking its toll.
I'd like to follow up on that. We know that about generally between only 6 and 7% of the cases of sexual abuse actually get reported to criminal justice or to any other authority. So children are being abused, but it isn't going anyplace because it doesn't get reported for any number of reasons. I want to also follow up on the comment that the worst thing that could happen would be for an adult to be falsely accused. Yes, I think that would be a bad thing to happen. I don't think it's the worst thing, but it is the choice we make. What tends to happen is people will say, well, I thought something was happening, but I didn't want to say anything because if I did and I was wrong, I might have ruined the life of that teacher. I rarely hear somebody say, I thought something was going on and I decided to say something because I knew if I didn't say something, the life of a child might be ruined. We don't have that equation. We're always worried about the adult. What we found in our studies of false accusations is that if you have good policies, there are very few false accusations, in that an investigation with kids almost immediately indicates whether or not the child's fabricating. It isn't like television where the kids are super intelligent and can figure out stories that you're never able to penetrate. In real life, kids make mistakes when they make up the stories, and an investigator finds that out very quickly.
I think you've raised an excellent point, Dr. Shakeshaft, because I don't think most people, including our viewers, understand possibly how the process works. I just want to take them through that and remind everyone that currently, the way it's set up right now, school administrators and teachers are not required to report sexual abuse by other school employees to the district attorney. They are only required to report it to those within the school system, and the school system has no legal requirement to report it to law enforcement authorities. In other words, teachers are only required to report abuse to the district attorney, but not abuse by other school employees. You're aware of this, and do you care to comment on that further?
Well, what I will say is that we did study school districts where there were documented incidents of teacher-to-student sexual abuse. I looked at 125 cases in New York, and in not one case did the school district contact the district attorney or the police. In every case, they dealt with them internally. They dealt with the issue internally. In some of the cases, after they began to deal with the issues internally, the parent went to the police or to the district attorney. But in my cases that I studied, never did the school district. That isn't to say that some school districts don't, but by and large, what we found nationwide is that school districts don't report to the police or to the district attorney. They see it as an in-house issue and problem, and they try to solve the issue in-house.
Frank,
It's incredible. It's just like the scandal in the Catholic Church, where I think the superintendents, most of them very well-intentioned, just like the bishops, thinking they're doing the right thing, and instead they're covering up a problem that I don't think they necessarily fully understood the ramifications of it down the road. I can't understand how else they could do it unless they're putting the image of the school district, you know, at such, of greater importance than protecting the children.
But what I'm concerned about right now is I'm hearing from both of you that there are major deficiencies in the law in terms of reporting abuse. And how do you feel about that? I can now understand clearly your frustration with our representation in the state of New York, in the sense that they're not getting it. What would you like to see done,
Well,
Frank?
we're pushing. We've been working with the district attorney in Nassau County, who's proposed legislation. We could not get the Nassau County legislature to act. Well, we've got all the Republicans lined up to support us. We've got 2 Democrats lined up. Judy Jacobs, who's the presiding officer, will not permit it to be discussed, because I think she's got a problem with reporting statutory rape, is what I think it is.
Yet she had no problem sponsoring a bill, if I recall, asking for the clergy to divulge the very same material recently.
She put clergy on, which was great. We agree with that. But she will not, but the clergy still only have to report abuse by a parent. We want the clergy to report abuse by other clergy, or by anyone they find out. Any child abuse, sexual abuse, should be reported. And if they don't think statutory rape should be a crime, then decriminalize it. I don't agree with them on that. I think it should be a crime. But they should approach the problem face up. Don't beat around the bush and cover up 75% of all sex abuse. It doesn't have to be reported. It's a crime. The superintendents are behaving just as bad as the bishops did, and no one talks about it. No one even knows about it.
I think that's shocking. We're close to the end of our show, and what I'd like to hear is if you have any final comments, Dr. Shakeshaft, if you'd like to offer our viewers before we close out the show.
I'd just say that this is a problem. I think we need to solve it. We need to solve it legally. We need to solve it in terms of policies and procedures in schools. We need to educate kids. We need to educate parents. And we need to educate teachers.
We have just about a minute, Frank, if you'd like to echo
Yeah, I would,
some-
and I would, if I understood again, Dr. Shakeshaft, did you not call for more study and more?
Yes.
I mean, I'm not a big one on the government going into more, but this is an area they've got to get into. They've got to spend some money and authorize good, solid research from an impartial basis, get the experts together, look at this and let's publicize it, for Pete's sake. And the legislators have got to start taking some action to correct the gross deficiencies in our law. And the New York legislators, the problem is in both parties. I know the Conservative Party is making this a big issue. They want to do it. We can't get the Republican leadership and Democratic leadership to budge, though.
We had just under a minute, but what would you like to advise our viewers in terms of what they can do, seeing that our senators and assembly people are up for election this coming November? What would you...
They should be contacting their state senators and state assemblymen and ask them to change the child abuse reporting law so that all child sexual abuse must be reported to the law enforcement authorities. That would solve the problem, by the way, in the church, too. No bishop is going to cover this up if he knows he goes to jail if he covers it up.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you would actually propose the law to be inclusive, not
All
just
inclusive.
not to highlight or single out the church or any organization. You want it
All
uniform. You want the same standard
all child
applied.
sexual abuse to be reported by these mandated reporters.
And so
most people agree with that.
And basically your approach then is to make this a comprehensive law,
That's
make
right.
it statewide, make it enforceable, and have it consistent with everything that we've
That's right.
experienced.
That's
Which,
right.
what you had said before, we need to make the language
Yes,
standard.
yes.
That it all means the same, no matter if you're in New York, New Jersey, or if in Connecticut, statewide, United States-wide, we need to have all the language in union with each other.
That's right. And when you report an incident, you're not saying that it's happened. You don't have to determine that. What you say is that you've seen some evidence that makes you concerned. The purpose of reporting is so that people who do know how to investigate and people who do know how to understand whether there's a problem come in and check it out. So you don't have to know for sure. You have to, what you have to know is that you have a concern, is that you see something that doesn't look right and you need to report it.
Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft, Frank Russo, my co-host, Donna Van Norden. Tonight's topic was sexual abuse in our schools. We thank our guests for being on about this very important topic and its impact to our state, to our region, to our country. The most important thing, our children, they need to get every opportunity to get a full education. And we implore our lawmakers to review this important matter. We thank you again. Please tune in again the same time next week for American Family Association Presents.